Hey everyone, it's Caitlin from Really Big Plant. Thank you so much for joining me. So for this video, we are going to be doing another episode of plant chores, and it's specifically going to be focused on my carnivorous plants.
Really big plant.
So I only have two carnivorous plants in my collection, a pitcher plant and a little Venus flytrap, and they need some help. So right here as a total eyesore in front of me is my Nepenthes alata, which is a type of carnivorous pitcher plant. And what we're seeing here is the dried flowers. I got this plant at the beginning of the pandemic. I've had it for a little while now. It was in the store that I'd been working in at the time, and this plant had been in the shop for a while and all the pitchers had already dried up. There was one pitcher left on it that was like fully dried out, but I stubbornly left it on the plant for a really long time anyway and had it that way for months after I brought it home. And it was pretty small when I first got it actually. And now it has gone crazy in this hallway where it gets really bright light and where I definitely don't give it enough water. So it's never actually produced pitchers for me. And I've had it for like almost 2 years now. And I've never really cared about it, but now I feel like I'm determined to make this thing grow some pitchers. It's flowered a couple times. It's made a pollen mess all over the place. So I want to repot it. And someone did ask in my comments, somebody who comments all the time, thank you, I appreciate you. Somebody asked to see a repotting on this plant. So we're doing it. This is the plant. It's in an 8-inch nursery pot. Oh, there's a bunch of dead leaves down there. I've noticed on the Nepenthes, these leaves don't just like come out. You have to cut them off with something. It's in this pot that's kind of too small. It doesn't have a tray under here, and I just water it in place, and it never really gets enough water. And I have it kind of supported on the pot handle, which I bet you couldn't see in there. So it's growing like this up here. These are some spent flowers. It looks like it's about to make a new flower right there. And this stuff all over it is pollen and dust. And then I have another branch that's coming over here. And it's winding its way down my hallway. So I can show you my feet for scale. It started over there. It's coming over this way. And it's all up in this plant, which is actually a pineapple plant. So this pineapple plant is really fun. I got it as a small one, and it's just been getting really, really big. And the leaves are very sharp. Ow. Yeah, so the leaves are really sharp on a pineapple plant. Be careful if you are thinking about getting one, because I feel like it's one of the more dangerous plants in my collection. And I just noticed when I was evaluating this plant just before starting filming that it is actually impaled on the pineapple plant. So this leaf is a leaf from the pitcher plant, and it looks like it got a little bit stabbed.
Really big plant.
All right, so I brought my plant over here. Oh, this is my supplies for the Venus flytrap that we're gonna do after this. Got it in here. Move this out of the way. Okay, so the first thing that we're gonna do with this plant is I'm gonna cut off all of these spent flowers. The blooms, actually, when it blooms, they're really beautiful. It has these like red and yellow flowers with these little speckles. It really is a beautiful display of flowers when this thing blooms. I have noticed, as somebody who is kind of allergic to pollen, when this thing is in full flower, it does make me kind of allergic, and I'm silly for not having gotten rid of these spent flowers sooner, because they still are releasing pollen. All right, so let's just backtrack for a second. I got ahead of myself starting stuff on this plant, but I did want to talk about just carnivorous plants in general for a second. So the only thing that carnivorous plants have in common with each other is that they consume animals, is the fact that they're carnivorous, but there actually are thousands of carnivorous plants. I believe there are about 1,000 species of them, and they are spread out between like a dozen or more, I think maybe 15, 17 different actual families of plants. So like when we talk about philodendrons, monsteras, and like alocasia. Those are all aroids, and that aroid family, Araceae, is just one singular family of plants. Carnivorous plants are spread out between a whole bunch of different families, so they are very, very distinct and not even closely related to each other at all. This pitcher plant, or not this pitcher plant, but pitcher plants in general are epiphytic plants, which means that they grow attached to things. They're not parasitic, but epiphytic, as in they grow on other plants, using them as support. Epiphyte, by the way, describes a growth habit. It's not like a family of plant, but a way that plants can grow. So plants that grow epiphytically, if you are familiar with them, you know that they don't like a whole lot of moisture, or they like to be able to dry out between waterings, excuse me. So a lot of them actually do appreciate a lot of moisture, but they don't want to have a root zone that is sitting in soaking wet potting medium. Now, here's where the Venus flytrap comes in. So I have this little Venus flytrap in a tube. You've probably seen these before at like a grocery store, at a hardware store, usually not in plant shops. I feel like it's one of the first plants I ever had like many years ago and killed it so fast. These Venus flytraps, they are not epiphytic. They are terrestrial. They actually like to grow in swampy, bog-like conditions. And so they like a lot of water, and they do not like to dry out between waterings. So the care for this pitcher plant and for this Venus flytrap, though they both are carnivorous plants, the care couldn't be more different. They really require very different things, and that's because they're from really different parts of the world. Pitcher plants are all from Asia, from Southeast Asia. They grow in the mountainy forests. There are lots of different types of pitcher plants at every different level of elevation, versus these Venus flytraps, which are from swampy areas, and they are native to North America. Actually, the United States has more carnivorous plants native than any other country. It's something that totally surprised me when I first learned that, and I feel like it's really kind of cool fact. So the Americas are known for the Venus flytraps, which are native to the Carolinas, and as well as another type of pitcher plant, those fluted ones, the sarracenias, which I don't own. We do have a lot of native carnivorous plants in the US if you are looking for more natives, because I think we usually think of carnivorous plants as being something that's extremely exotic, and I think for that reason we're surprised to learn as Americans that a lot of them originate from here in the United States. They have been sort of demolished to near extinction, most of the species, just because wetlands are where these plants grow, and wetlands are not areas that are very usable by people. So over time, a lot of the natural environments for these plants have been reformed and demolished and made suitable for human use rather than for swampy plant growth. So a lot of these plants are actually very endangered. I learned recently that they can handle freezing conditions because they grow in the Carolinas, right? So they can handle winter. They can handle freezing conditions, like not below zero, but they can stay outside all year round, and they actually do want a winter dormancy period. So that's really cool. And I learned that some people do actually keep these in their refrigerator over the winter in order to give this plant the dormancy period they need if they live in somewhere without winter, like me. So anyway, we're gonna get to this one in a second. So yeah, there's a little bit of a rundown on the difference between some of the carnivorous plants. And you know, there are a lot more of them. There are butterworts, which they look kind of like little succulents with like sticky leaves. And then there are sundews, which are really cool plants. They're kind of gross looking in my opinion, actually, but they have this like long tendril with these other little tendrils on them, like long sort of tongue covered in these little spike tendrily things that have a little dewdrop on the end that looks like it glistens like a little drop of water, but it's actually like fly paper, and it catches bugs on it and just digests them right there on the spot. So anyway, there are a lot of really cool carnivorous plants. Back to this pitcher plant. I don't even know what the root system looks like on a pitcher plant, so I have no idea whether it would be a good idea to pot into a much larger pot or if I should try to just keep it in the same thing. So let's just open this up and take a look at what's going on in there. Can you see this? This tendril from one of the leaves is wrapped around this. Can you see how it's holding on there? So that's one of the ways that this plant is able to climb in nature and attach itself to stuff. The pitchers grow on these little tendrils that curl around things and hold on to them. I'm just going to repot it into a very slightly larger pot. The root system is really thin. I had no idea what these roots were going to look like. I had a feeling they weren't going to be too chunky. They are very delicate, and there's nothing about this to me that looks like it's root bound, and I don't really want to disturb these roots. I started trying to like feel into the soil ball a little bit, and I could sense, you know, when you can kind of feel the snapping of roots, like you can't necessarily hear it, but it's like you can feel as you're pulling it apart that you're ripping things. And I can tell that I'm ripping through this root system. So I'm just gonna transplant it basically into a pot that's almost exactly the same size. And then I'm gonna put it on a very, very tall bamboo pole. So this is a little bit of orchid bark here. I'm not too picky about which potting media I use. I usually try to pick up potting soil from my local garden centers because I've noticed that the markup for shipping potting mediums is pretty high. It usually ends up like at least doubling, if not quadrupling the price of soils and potting media because they're really heavy and most people want a large quantity. And so I think usually when you order potting media online, a lot of times what you're paying for is the shipping cost. That's not true of all things. You know, the really light materials, moss and peat moss, and and like cocoa husk and all of those things tend to be pretty cheap. But when you're ordering like bark, orchid bark, and like sandy coarse potting media, those can get really expensive online. And I've noticed that I tend to try to just go with whatever's in the store just because the price difference is so enormous, and I found that it tends to not make too much of a difference. But there are a couple of different potting bark, orchid bark things that I've liked to use on some of my aroids, and I am going to be using this orchid mix at the bottom of this pot just to give this plant a little bit of something at the bottom. I always say this, but it's important. Really try not to breathe in the particulate from substrate when it makes a big dust cloud. Like step away, let it settle. You can moisten it ahead of time. I like to work with the dry potting media. If you like to work with it moist, this isn't an issue. But that particulate, it's so bad for your lungs. It's like air quality in China. You know, it's really not, it's not good for you. So if you're gonna be doing like a repotting marathon, it's actually my advice to put a mask on. Save your lungs, spare your lungs, because this stuff is not good. It's like just small enough to inhale, but too big for your body to clear properly. So it just sits there in your body and it's not good for you. So instilling a little bit of fear because you shouldn't be breathing in the dust from potting media. Especially perlite too. Perlite's gotten so popular and that it makes those enormous dust clouds. Don't breathe that stuff in. It's really not good. You're inhaling rocks. Okay, I care about you guys. I don't want you breathing in rocks. The mix isn't anything that interesting. It really looks like normal soil. It's got some like dusty bits. It's got a lot of wood chips in there. I tend to go with potting media. Yeah, I tend to go with potting media that has a lot of wood chips and it's very splintery and it gives you splinters. That's usually the ones that I go for. I'm figuring out where I want to put the pole because I don't want to jam it into the root system, and this pot is just slightly larger than the soil ball and there's still a little bit of space on the side. So normally I try to put the plant in the center and backfill all around the edges, but this time because I want to make some room for this really thick pole, I kind of pushed this whole soil ball over to one side of the pot to kind of make some room. So I'm using this orchid mix, but I also think that it would be really acceptable to use whatever your normal potting soil is mixed in with a good amount of perlite. Okay, I feel like this looks great now. Okay, we're doing it. We're gonna propagate it. I've got this one branch here. It looks healthy and ready for propagation. I'm gonna go ahead and cut this one and we're gonna experiment on it. I don't know if you can see what I'm about to do, but I'm gonna cut it like right in here. Okay, the deed is done. Look, I feel like it's cute now. So I'm gonna water it, and I'm hoping that these leaves are gonna pop back, so I'll keep you updated on what happens. When I first got it, it did only have one little plant in the pot, or maybe there was one plant and one little baby starting to grow. There are 5 plants in there now, or one of them I guess I just cut back, but I did leave a little stump of it in there so that hopefully it can sprout a new plant. Now I'm hoping that we can grow pitchers on it. This is my new goal for this plant. We're gonna grow some pitchers this year, or I'm going to try my darndest to get this thing to grow some pitchers. If you do have a pitcher plant that's growing pitchers, congratulations, that's awesome. I recently learned that you can put fertilizer pellets straight into the pitchers instead of trying to feed it live prey. Don't overdo it, like one tiny granule. I have these, Osmocote has a slow release fertilizer granule thing. They're these like little balls. You've probably noticed them in plants that you've bought before, like these little green spheres in the soil. These ones aren't green. They are like little tan balls, but so one of the things that carnivorous plants have in common is their carnivory, of course, and that is an adaptation to deal with all of them being in environments where they can't get all of the nutrients they need. And so as a means of trying to survive, and the way that they've adapted in order to deal with that nutrient deficiency is they've evolved mechanisms to be able to trap and eat living things which have the nutrients available. Pitcher plants have lots of different things that they like to eat. So some of them attract insects by having a sweet smelling sap on the inside of their pitcher, and the insects come and they get stuck on the inside, or they drown in the fluid in there, and the plant then is able to dissolve that insect and absorb those nutrients. But other pitcher plants rely on being pooped in. Not pitcher plants, they're toilet plants, which is hilarious. I mean, they're not called toilet plants, they're called pitcher plants, but I call them toilet plants, and I think some other people also call them toilet plants because they've really evolved to be toilets, not pitchers. No one should be drinking out of those. And so the way they work, there's some in particular that have evolved to attract this one type of little tree shrew, and I will show you a picture of these pitcher plants. They are hilarious, and the way they work is they've got the pitcher, like a little toilet, and the lid is open, and the little tree shrew comes and it sits over the open pitcher hole, and the lid of the little pitcher, the little toilet lid, develops a sticky sap on it. And in order to be able to lick the sap, which feeds the little tree shrew, and they like to eat it like a little meal, in order to reach it, they kind of have to stand over the hole of the pitcher, and while they're eating, they simultaneously will go to the bathroom inside of the pitcher, and that is the pitcher's reward for feeding this little shrew, this little rodent. And so it's a very symbiotic relationship where they both provide something the other one needs. And so there are lots of kinds of pitcher plants. Some of them attract certain types of bats, and the shape of the pitcher is something that catches the echolocation of the bats. Some of the pitchers have evolved certain shapes to be very attractive to little bats that will then go and hide inside of those pitchers and sleep inside of them, and also use it as a bathroom while they're in there. And so these pitchers have developed all sorts of different ways of attracting living things to come either be their actual food or to use them like a bathroom in order to absorb some nutrients from something other than the substrate that they're in their environment. That's also true of like the Venus flytraps. They grow in these bog conditions with lots of water that ultimately flushes out all of the nutrients that would normally be available to a plant's root systems. And so they develop this mechanism for catching things and to get the nutrients they need. Okay, let's chop this up now. So I've never done this before, and these nodes look weird to me. They kind of like don't have a clear internode section. They kind of just emerge one leaf after the other. So these leaves are flat this direction, and then the side of the leaf sort of comes around the side and has this flap that forms here. And you can see that it goes all the way down into the junction of the leaf below it. And it's kind of weird to try to figure out where to cut. Let's just start. So what I'm doing is I'm clipping sections that have 2 leaves. And then what I'm gonna do with these 2 leaf sections is cut off the lower leaf. To expose a little bit more of the stem area and to create something that looks a little bit more like a normal propagation, which has like, you know, stem below the leaf attached. And I did read about these that when they do grow roots, they don't grow out of the node, but they grow out of where the scar tissue is, which means that it's gonna come out of the cut end on the bottom, kind of like on a peperomia when you propagate any type of peperomia caparata, like a peperomia frost, and you put those in water. The roots grow usually first right from wherever the wound is, from the bottom of the cutting. Unlike on like a pothos or a monstera, those roots grow from the nodes and from where the aerial roots develop along the sides of the stem. I've got 5 cuttings here that have 2 nodes on them that I cut 1 leaf off of. And then I have the end piece, which I'm leaving like this. I cut 1 leaf off of this. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces that are just single node propagations. And then I've got this one with 2 nodes and 2 leaves, and this one with 2 leaves and 3 nodes. Okay, so we are trying a couple different techniques. I just filled this cup with sphagnum moss, and revealing my bias, I guess, a little bit, I am going to put the top cutting into the moss because I do think that these plants probably will prefer the moss over every other medium, just because in the past moss has tended to work the best for me for propagations. I know that there is a lot of environmental concern right now about the sphagnum moss, and I think a lot of people have chosen to move towards perlite. What I will say is this houseplant hobby involves trying to recreate nature indoors, and that involves borrowing some stuff from nature in order to try to recreate those environments. And I'm not saying that we should be willy-nilly not caring about how different potting media affect the environment, but I think that having an awareness is a good place to start, and having these dialogues is important because it changes the way that huge companies that do these things on a giant scale, it changes the way that they have their practices in place. So, sticking these propagations into this moss. We're gonna do one in perlite. I've never propagated just in perlite before. There's something about this that feels really silly to me, just pouring this much perlite in here. But I guess I'm trusting you guys. People have said that perlite works really well for them, so we're doing it. This maybe isn't a fair test too, because I've never propagated in Nepenthes before, but might as well give it a try. Let me go ahead and pour some water in there. And then these ones, I've got 4 in here. These are gonna just be water propagations. So that's really easy. Just gonna pour some water in. And then these ones, I will do as soil propagations. I don't know if this is gonna work, but you can always hope. Oh my gosh, okay, I was totally just poo-pooing on this perlite, but I poured the water in and I feel it with my finger now, and I see how this might be perfect for propagating plants. The level of moisture at the top of this perlite is like perfect, and I don't think it's because I poured in the perfect amount of moisture, but because perlite is porous and it does absorb some water, and it is wicking water up to the top of this cup, but it's also very porous and is going to keep air in there. I'd imagine that plants love this, and I'm definitely going to try propagating some more stuff in perlite. Let me know what your experience with perlite propagation has been. Thank you to the few people who have commented and talked about it a little bit. Yeah, if you've had great success with perlite propagations, I would love to hear from you. And now we're gonna take a look at my Venus flytrap. I've got this terrarium here that I think I wanna put it inside of. This has a bunch of dead stuff in it. It was a little fern terrarium. I put it on top of my refrigerator or something silly like that, and everything in here dried up. It was really cute once, to be honest. I feel like you can imagine how cute it was. I think I'm gonna try to put this little Venus flytrap in here. It's the time of day that I call death o'clock, but the sun's streaming in. My plants over there, I think, rely on this little bit of direct sun. I've got this Venus flytrap here in this little container, and I've actually had this we're going on like 3 months now. I haven't even opened this, and I noticed that I've started to have some dieback of some of the plant in here, so I need to take care of it. The tricky thing with these Venus flytraps is they want a lot of light. They prefer to be outside in some full sun. They like bright, hot, direct light. And a lot of times these tubes that they get sold in have stuff printed on them, and sometimes it goes way high up and will block out the light from reaching the plant. So that can be really problematic for these, especially if you're wanting to put it in a north or east facing window where it's not going to get that direct sun. It can be really hard for these to survive. So I've been putting mine on my table right in front of my bay windows where I don't keep a lot of plants because it's very hot light. And this Venus flytrap is actually doing really well there for it. I've only watered it once or twice because it's in this closed container. There are a couple holes on the top, but I've just opened it and just dumped some water in, and it is sitting in some water. You can't really tell because it's not transparent. Maybe you can kind of see through the bottom, but there's some water in there. And these are swamp plants. They're from boggy areas, and they do want to sit in water pretty much all the time, which is an alarming thing for houseplant people because you know that rots roots. They don't necessarily like to be in a closed environment. They would rather be out in the open air, but if you're like me and you're an underwaterer, these guys really can't handle underwatering. I think being in a closed system where they maybe do have a little bit too much humidity is still preferable to being out in the open and then getting underwatered. So when you get a plant, you're entering into a new relationship and you have to figure things out. And you know, you make compromises for each other. And so I know that I'm an underwaterer, and ideally I wouldn't be, but one of the compromises that I'm asking this plant to take on my behalf is that it's going to live inside of a closed space to keep it as moist as it wants to be without needing me to water it all the time. Whoa, it was really hard to get that out of that container. I think because I'm kind of afraid of this plant, I just noticed. I'm like scared to touch the traps, which is silly because, you know, they're not gonna eat me. It's totally an irrational fear, but something about the way that this plant like is responsive and moves, it's kind of freaky. Ooh, it's like thrilling. Getting my thrills in, just repotting this plant. Venus flytraps are so cool. Dionaea, muscipula. Dionaea is the genus, and the dion in there refers to Aphrodite, also known as Venus, which is why these are called Venus flytraps. And muscipula, the specific species of this plant, means mousetrap or flytrap. So Venus flytrap is a pretty literal translation of the Latin name. The way these work is that they attract insects to them by producing a sticky sweet sap on the inside of their little traps, and they have these little trigger hairs in the traps that are sensitive to touch and to movement, and when they feel something moving around, the trap springs shut. The way that it works is really cool. It's an electrochemical impulse. I'm not gonna get, you know, too much into the mechanics. It's got these little hairs. There's usually, I believe, like 4 or something. There's a really specific amount of hairs, maybe 2 on each side of the trap. And in order to trigger the trap shut, those little hairs on the inside need to be touched. So you can touch other places on the trap all around and even on the sticky pad, and you won't get the traps to close. It needs to be specifically on the little hairs in order to get the traps to close. So you see how I'm touching this and it's not doing anything? It's because I didn't touch the hairs that are like the activation trigger to get this to close. And not only do you need to touch the trigger hairs, but you need to touch them twice within a certain interval in order to spring the trap. So it takes a lot of energy for this plant to do what it does. And when it closes and when it catches prey and it senses that there's, you know, something trapped in there, the plant goes through all of these changes where the little teeth close and they seal up and they grow together and they form a seal. And then that entire pod with its prey inside fills with a digestive enzyme, and it turns itself from being like a flypaper trap into a self-contained stomach that digests its food. And so it fills with a liquid, it goes through a digestive process, it absorbs the nutrients from its prey, and then eventually it opens back up and is ready to catch something again. But all of that process takes so much energy for the plant that it's really not worth it for it to go through all of that if there's nothing inside. And so this plant has a really cool thing where the trigger hairs need to be triggered multiple times in order for the plant to spring shut. And that kind of ensures to the plant that it's not wasting its time on something not alive. And not only that, once it does spring shut, the prey needs to be alive inside of there, moving around inside the trap and triggering those little trigger hairs in order for the Venus flytrap to then release the enzymatic juices that digest its prey. So it goes through a multiple stage process of verification to make sure that it is in fact using its time and energy wisely, digesting things that it actually wants to eat. And it does kind of stress the plants out to trigger the traps shut. So while it can be fun to kind of touch it and to show how the traps can spring shut every now and again, it does kind of stress the plants out, and they will stay closed for a day or two before they open up again. And if you keep triggering it without there being something in there, I think that can be harmful to the plant eventually. So I would say if you've got curious people in your household, maybe ask them not to touch this plant too much. All right, it's looking way cuter already because I just cleaned it up. The other really gross thing about the fly traps, in my opinion, is after they do catch their prey and they digest what they can eat, they open back up and they spit the body out. Like they digest all of the juices and the soft part of the bugs, like the enzymes go in and they dissolve the insides, but the exoskeleton of insects isn't really easily digestible, not for any of these plants. So all of the carnivorous plants that eat bugs and stuff like that, if you open up the very mature pitchers or traps, a lot of times there are lots of skeletons in the closet. I think that's really gross. So if you're feeding bugs to your Venus flytraps, when they do open back up, if you see a dead bug in there, the plant ate what it could, and those are the bones, and it left them behind and it's spitting them out. I'm not gonna replant this in here because it's not deep enough. You see how this dish is shorter than the pot? So what I think I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just put this in here and I'm gonna surround it with rocks, and I'm gonna let it just stay in this same tiny pot and essentially bottom water in here all the time. And experts and growers who grow Venus flytraps recommend this method. I mean, not this exact setup, but setting the little grow pots in standing water and just letting them live like that. It's a little small in there, huh? It's kind of up against the top. Well, okay, what I'm gonna do is, since this lid sits a little bit into this dish, I'm gonna fill the dish with rocks, and then hopefully the lid will sit up a little higher, and that might be enough room for it. I bought this little baggie of rocks when I bought this plant months ago with the intention of doing something like this. Just never got around to it. But actually, I feel like it was a good opportunity to just see how this plant would do in its little tube. And it lasted in here for a really long time, and it's still doing well. And I think it could have continued staying in this tube. And it was happy because I was giving it enough light. I put it where it was getting hours of direct sun every day in that tube. And it's been there for a couple months and it's doing really well. So I'm hoping that I'm not going to be, ruining it now that I'm changing the situation, but I think as long as it's getting bright light and it sits in a little bit of water, it should be okay. This is another thing that I would recommend probably trying to find in person rather than ordering online, because it's rocks and they're really heavy, and the shipping costs will be really expensive. So if you don't have like a little plant shop near you that sells sort of unnecessary fancy things like bags of different colored decorative rocks, you can always check at pet supply stores or at a pet shop. Aquarium shops also can be a really good option because they tend to stock a lot of things that are actually higher quality than you would use on plants, because they're for animals. Fish, or any place that sells reptiles or reptile supplies might also have really interesting decorative like rocks and other substrates. This is really cute. I feel like this would look cuter if the black pot in there was different. So I'm gonna keep my eye out for a little cute pot that I think I could replace that with, and then keep this whole thing in this setup. These Venus flytraps generally would like distilled water, but I don't have any distilled water right now, and so I'm gonna just give it regular water. You can use bottled water and stuff like that too, but there are still like fluoride gets added to drinking water, and that is something that is a mineral that's dissolved in the water that these plants really don't like. They're used to very, very clean water. But if you don't have distilled water, they would rather have any water than no water at all. So I'm gonna go ahead and just water this plant with the water that I've got, because I know that this plant would prefer slightly less than ideal water to not enough water. So we're doing it. Okay, so that was super easy. I just added in a little layer of water into the bottom of this pebble tray. And this obviously looks so much better than the inside of this tube. Wait, is this not like so cute? This is so cute now. I almost feel like that little black pot in the middle doesn't even matter. I kind of don't even notice it. I mean, it would be way cuter if it was green or matching the color of the rocks, but I don't know. This is cute. I like this like this. Yeah. So I'm psyched for my pitcher plant update. I feel like it looks great over here now, and I know that it's gonna be happier, and I'm gonna take better care of it now that I have it in a pot that I like. So yeah, I'm feeling really good about that all around, and I'm really excited about getting the little Venus flytrap situated as well. I think that that's gonna be a really fun plant to have and just to keep my eye on, and we'll see if I can catch some bugs for it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. I would love to hear from you on what carnivorous plants you care for in your collection. I really hope that you enjoyed watching this video, and I hope you all are having a super fantastic week, and I hope to catch you in the next one. Bye.